can do afterwards is we can send you the slides from this, but I want you to help me bring up Dylan Pepper. Dylan joined Mike Beasley in the 5280 strategies in January of 18, following a 3 years as a professional hockey referee, which seems appropriate in what the work he does now. He works extensively at the Joint Budget Committee, monitoring and tracking client interest with more than 40 billion state budget that is, 40 billion on the state budget that is constantly evolving. Is more important than ever to track and advocate how the state is allocating money. So please help me welcome Dylan Pepper.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Feels kind of like a letdown with Julie McCluskey and Senator Rankin here, but I'll give you my best and let's talk about state money a little bit. So I wanted to start with just kind of a general fund budget overview. From 2 years ago when the pandemic first started to where we are now, we've seen over a $5 billion increase in general fund revenue. Next year in 22-23, the state is projected to have $3.2 billion more dollars to spend and save than they had in this current fiscal year. Of that $3.2 billion, it is inclusive of a 15% reserve requirement, and that was passed last year in the long bill. It does not, however, include caseload growth or inflation. And because of higher inflation and more people on Medicaid due to the pandemic, that's projected to be between $500 and $700 million this year. So the state has about $2.5 billion more general fund dollars to spend and save than they had last year when you take into account caseload growth and inflation. They also are subject to a $1.8 billion TABOR refund. On November 1st, Governor Polis submitted his $40 billion budget. It included $1 billion more general fund, as well as the 15% reserve. It also included a $205 million buy down of the budget stabilization factor for K-12 education. There are some political discussions currently happening about how we could buy down all $572 million of the budget stabilization factor. So that will be a continuing ongoing discussion, and that $205 million may be larger once session ends in May. He also put $52 million towards higher education. This will hold tuition flat year over year. One of the biggest single line items is for air quality. And this includes $255 million for rapidly greening our transportation system, which includes over $150 million for electric buses, $50 million for decarbonizing the industrial and aviation sectors, and then $52 million for additional FTE and monitoring equipment within CDPHE. He's also putting $200 million additional dollars into affordable housing and homelessness. This is in addition to the $550 million that the state allocated of federal ARPA money to address affordable housing. He's also putting $113 million into public safety. This is to expand and invest community policing models for loan forgiveness, justice-involved behavioral health workforce, early intervention grants, and workforce investments. Things that this funds, it's like the co-responder grant model, which I know some counties have taken advantage of. They're looking at extending that through this $113 million investment in public safety. And the last thing, the single biggest line item in his budget proposal is supporting small businesses. $600 million of the $700 million is for unemployment insurance relief. That would be to buy down the state's outstanding balance, which is over $1 billion, which will lower premium and fee relief. It won't buy it all down, but it's a good start. So I already briefly mentioned it, but in addition to the $2.5 billion general fund dollars, the state also received $3.8 billion in ARPA money. They've allocated about $1.2 billion of this money already. There's about $2.6 million outstanding that's being worked through on how we want to invest that in the state to get the biggest bang for our buck. These coronavirus funds must be obligated by the end of December 2024 and must be expended by the end of December 2026. So here's how the money's been spent so far. This was all done through legislation that was passed at the end of last session. $300 million is directly allocated by the governor. $380 million went to Senate Bill 21260, which was the transportation legislation that passed at the end of last session. And then these were the two big ones that took a lot of time this interim, were the Affordable Housing and Behavioral Health Task Force, which each were allocated $550 million to create transformational change in affordable housing and behavioral health. These committees met over the summer and they created subgroups that met countless times. They both issued final reports that they are going to try to pass legislation and implement legislation using those $450 million they each have. We also did $200 million for $200 million for workers, employees, and workforce centers. That money has went out the door to these organizations, but a lot of it hasn't been expended yet. So they've done a supplemental in the last month to ask for continuous funding authority, continuous appropriation authority, so they're able to spend that money as they get requests for it. And lastly was $848 million for economic recovery and relief. This included $75 million for additional broadband money, as well as $40 million to the Colorado Economic Development Fund. So like I said, what's next? The Task Force on Economic Recovery and Relief met 4 times over this interim. This committee was tasked with finding ways and measurements on how we spend the $2.6 billion in federal money we still have. That committee recommended $500 million for unemployment relief, and then created a process by which legislators are able to submit proposals, which will be evaluated through a series of metrics to see what sort of economic impact they'll have to communities as they try to help people who were most affected by the pandemic. The deadline for that was January the 3rd, and they'll be working through those proposals and recommending legislation based on that. Separate and aside from ARPA and the money we got, through the state budget, we also got some money from the Infrastructure and Jobs Investment Act. Colorado received $3.7 billion for roads, including $225 million for bridge repair, $900 million for transportation projects, and $57 million for EV charging stations. The state will also receive a minimum allocation of $100 million for broadband, and that's a minimum amount. That number is likely to be higher. That money once it's received will get distributed through OEDIT. Kate Sneed, who used to work at the broadband office, has moved over to OEDIT to help oversee the distribution of the federal funds received for broadband. There's also $688 million to improve water infrastructure across the state and to ensure that clean, safe drinking water is a right in all communities. $432 million for airports, and $35 million to protect against wildfires, as well as $16 million to protect against cyber attacks. The last slide I wanted to bring up was some tax policy legislation. So over the last 2 years, the legislature has been focused on decoupling the state tax code from the federal tax code. Those efforts have largely, because of our strong budget position, have led to a rise. Money that they are bringing in is almost exclusively going to a TABOR refund, with the idea that in the next economic downturn, hopefully the bottom won't be as bad. But the decoupling isn't really bringing new revenue into the state. It's mostly going to the refund. And I just put a couple examples up here of where you'll feel that. The only one that doesn't necessarily is House Bill 1164, which will raise local mills in every school district by 1 mill a year until they reach 27 mills, or where they debruce locally. In the first year that they implemented this, which is this year, this raises about $95 million in revenue for the state. Once fully implemented, it'll raise about $400 million in new revenue for the state of Colorado. That $95 million that they received this year was allocated to the School Finance Interim Committee, and they're looking at new ways to increase special education funding. And it's an ongoing process. They have a bill draft that was released last week. So that'll continue to be ongoing. The other part I wanted to bring up with tax legislation, and particularly with education, is if they do a $572 million buy down of budget stabilization factor, how do they afford that on an ongoing basis? That's been a number we haven't been able to fully buy down in almost 14 years since it was created. So what is next? There's a reassessment cycle that's coming up, and they think the local share will be increased by $300 or $400 million. And their plan is to basically offset the negative factor buy down with the new local share money that's coming in through higher property tax revenues. But it will become a priorities discussion because the state of Colorado, we are at our max. They will have to find a way to prioritize their spending and pick what they want to spend on. So whether it's, social services, Medicaid, human services, K-12, or $500 million in green energy, it is going to be a values-based discussion from here on forward because we are at our cap for new revenue that's coming in. And that's kind of a real quick high-level overview, and I wanted to leave 10 or 15, 20 minutes for questions. Yep.
Look, there's a microphone right here. I'm just wondering if there's any real serious contemplation about asking the public to raise that revenue cap and use the potential Tabor refund for critical issues across the state, such as affordable housing, obtainable housing, and school districts and programs like that, rather than everyone get enough of a refund for a case of beer to ask us if we would like to put it towards community uses or wine.
I know we've seen in the past ballot measures run. Those haven't been met with a lot of success. I am sure we'll see ballot measures run again, particularly in the K-12 and higher ed space that directs the money for additional K-12 and higher ed funding. I wouldn't venture a guess on the success or failure of those at this current time, but I'm sure we will see some sort of measure given the amount of money that's in the Tabor refund. I'm sure that we'll see something in the next 2 elections.
Thanks for all of the updates on that. One of my questions was about the refund as well, because it's an ongoing issue that has been for years. There's always been a pool of money there that's been building, but it costs more to get it into the hands of the taxpayers than it does to refund it. And until that pool is big enough, then they have to figure out a way to actually refund it to the taxpayers. So I guess the only additional question is, has there even been talk about the mechanism of how they're going to refund it? My other question is in regard to the $380 million that you talked about being allocated to Senate Bill 260. Did you detail on what that exactly went to? Because I don't remember seeing the check when it comes to our county in rural Colorado, and I kind of venture a guess as to where that 380 may have disappeared to, but I don't think it went to fixing any of the highways out in rural Colorado.
So to the first question on the refund and the refund mechanisms, the only conversation that I've heard so far is whether or not they want to increase the senior homestead exemption to take up more of that. But all the refund mechanisms will be filled through the $1.8 billion. And then, like you said, there will be a check received. But as far as changing the refund mechanism, the only conversation I've heard so far is about increasing the senior property tax exemption. To the $380 million, that was supposed to go to fund CDOT's 10-year plan. I can't speak where that money's been seen or hasn't been seen yet. But an interesting aside to that was Senate Bill 260, one of the governor's other budget proposals this year on eliminating fees would delay most of the new fees created in Senate Bill 260. So that $380 million is really the only new money we'll see because he's delayed the implementation of a lot of the new fees. So there's not that was 1 year, that was one money. It was supposed to go to implement the 10-year plan that CDOT outlined. But until if those new fees ever get implemented, or if they continue to be delayed, I don't know. But for the time being, that is the only new money that they've put in.
So, like on the budget, and I was looking at the $1.2 billion that you'll be coming out, $550 billion over the next 5 years. And then, I noticed in the graph, the opposite side, it said 660 billion of it will go to previously passed transportation projects. And so, when I see a budget like that, question, how much of that, the 650 was obligated to previously funded or past transportation projects? Because this would be the ARPA money on some of it, right?
Yeah.
And so, because, when you look at it, it ain't 1.2 billion that's coming to all of us. Half of it was already taken off and for projects. So, we're already down to half of the money. And that a lot of it will go to the second half to cities and stuff. I just hate to see rural Colorado get the short end of the stick. And how do we know, how much of that, the previously past transportation projects are in there? They solve their whole problem, and are they going to be coming after that second half of 660?
So the first 1.2 billion was everything they spent. It wasn't necessarily all going to transportation projects. The share of ARPA money that went for transportation projects was this 380 million. So the 1.2 billion dollars that was spent, I will say much of that actually hasn't gone out the door yet. It was allocated for programs, but because of federal reporting guidelines, a lot of that money is still sitting within state agencies waiting to be deployed. Of the remaining $2.6 billion, I think there's a real discussion to be had about how that's spent and what programs they're gonna fund. And I think the rural urban divide is going to be front and center about how we provide services to those most in need with this $2.6 billion. How do we get money targeted to people who suffered during the pandemic? How do we make sure everybody equally feels this economic expansion as we enter a post-COVID world? And they want to use that money. I know they want to distribute it evenly. And I think right now that's where a lot of the political discussion will play.
What in particular are you guys really focused on watching? You guys are watchdogs for them. What do you really focus on watchdogging for with this particular budget?
I think the money, the investments in green energy and electric charging stations, green buses is a lot. But I've already mentioned it a couple of times. The K-12 stuff's a big deal. And with this amount of money outstanding, there's been a years-long, decades-long discussion about how we redo our school finance formula. There's a thought that with this much money, it's easier to make changes when times are flush. So I think we'll pay attention closely to the school finance discussion and how they allocate any new dollars that buy down that budget stabilization factor. How do you get that money directed towards the student, make budgeting student-centered in schools? And I think that will be the biggest area, because it truly is the most. I mean, the K-12 education is 35% of the state general fund budget. When you talk about money at play, that is the most money at play. And so I think that's the number one thing we're focused on. But I mean, there is so much money right now. I mean, it's truly almost an overwhelming amount of money between the state general fund, ARPA money, and infrastructure money. It's making sure that nothing falls through the cracks is the other thing I would say. And making sure those funds are targeted and actually helping people out. Anybody else? Is that okay? All righty. Thank you, guys.